for coming. My slides are a little bit more bad than overseas, but that's all right. I'm going to take a step back and talk a little bit more broadly about generative AI in healthcare. So my goal here really is to sort of question this, or not question, but consider this new development. It's generative AI or foundation models. They've seen significant uptake and excitement. And I guess the question is, are they at a point where we can start deploying them for healthcare applications? And if not, what are the main barriers, ethical or non-ethical, to doing so? There's definitely a lot of hype, there's definitely a lot of excitement, but let's try and sort of look past that and see, where we actually are. And so I'm going to talk about three main categories, or I'm going to think through three main questions, and then we're going to stop at the fourth one, and we're going to consider, hopefully through the discussion. But very briefly, I want to sort of talk about what foundation models or generative AI are, and how are they different from what's come before. I want to talk a little bit about what the current or speculated applications in healthcare are, because they are very much speculative at this point. And maybe, as a third point, draw out some of the key ethical and safety risks with these models in healthcare. Yes. So what is generative AI? What are foundation models? If anyone here is very technical, I beg your patience. Just want to make sure that we have a common denominator here. So functionally, generative AI, foundation models, large language models, they're effectively very, very similar. They're picking out the same thing at this day and age. Generative AI talks about AI that has the potential to generate content, whether that's text or images. Foundation models are large models which can serve as a foundation for multiple downstream applications. And large language models are just very large language models. So how are they large? Well, they're large in size in terms of parameter count. So I think I really like this graph. It shows how the parameter count has increased with models over time. Just about 10 years ago or 14 years ago, when we started to have the sort of revolution in image models, we were at about 1 million parameters, so to speak, at the most, with the sort of vision models that were coming out. We're now at over 1 trillion. I think GPT-4 is meant to be over 1 trillion parameters, sort of an ensemble model, 8 models with 220 billion parameters or so. So very, very big, very hefty models. They're also large in terms of the data used for pre-training. So Palm 2 was trained on 3.6 trillion tokens. Palm was trained on 780 billion tokens, something like 54 gigabytes of information or so. As a result of 1 and 2, size and data, they're large in terms of compute needed for training. But not just for training, they're also large in terms of compute needed for inference. So every time you run a query through these models, the amount of computational power necessary for that is much, much more massive than it used to be, just because of the fact that all that information now has to flow through 1 trillion parameters instead of 1 million parameters. And they're also large in terms of costs, right? So GPT-4 reportedly cost over $100 million US. That's while these costs per model size are going to go down over the years, they already have. GPT-3 cost something like 4.5 billion in 2020. Now, if you're trying to train for the same level of capability, it'll cost about 450,000. But the size of these models is going to be pushed forward. All of this is very burdensome, and it would be burdensome. But fortunately or unfortunately, they're also large in terms of performance. So that makes this a lot more worthwhile. So how are they different? And they're very different from existing models in multiple ways, but I'm going to focus on 3. They are multimodal, they are much more generally applicable, and they have higher levels of capability. So when it comes to multimodality, previous machine learning models were modality specific. They operated on text, they operated on images, both for the inputs that they were able to consume and also the outputs that they were able to provide. The new era of foundation models are multimodal, both for inputs and outputs. So you have MedPalm, which is the sort of fine-tuned medical model based on Palm 2 that Google trained just this year, right? And you can see the modalities that it operates over: chest x-rays, dermatology, mammography, clinical notes, genomics, lab tests, and so on. And if you look at modality even much more broadly than that, we have text and conversations now, we have image analysis. Models in the future are going to be able to look at sound, they're going to be able to look at video, right? So extremely multimodal. They're much more general than the models that came before. So previous models were usually focused on one task. More complex models were focused on more complex tasks, but usually like similar. So you're doing, for instance, diagnosis around like 50 or 100 diagnostic codes instead of something where you're just measuring the presence of one disease or something. But foundation models now are able to operate not just over more tasks within a domain, but they're also able to operate across multiple domains. And so this is from for GPT 3.5. GPT 4 is even more broadly applicable. You can see that it's performing at high percentile levels for a variety of topics that humans are normally tested on. And you can see the gains that are arising from GPT 3.5 to GPT 4. And finally, in terms of capability, previous models were able to operate at near human capability for specific tasks, for instance, in radiological applications. Everyone is familiar with that. They were able to outperform early career doctors, but were subsequently outperformed by more expert doctors. Current models are able to operate at human level performance for even more tasks, although I think recent research suggests that like for medical reasoning, they might be able to perform at the level of a GP, but they are not able to match the performance of specialists. But this is just an example. So this is the performance of different models based on the US medical licensing exam questions. Just last year when MedPalm was released, we were at 67.2% accuracy. Now we're at 86.5% accuracy. There were physician rated questions and answers that were done for MedPalm 2, and across the 9 categories that we see there, there's only one category where it was outperformed by other physicians tested. Obviously, depending on the physicians, we take this with a grain of salt, but on almost all other categories, it outperformed them. So that's where we are with foundation models. That's how they are different. That's what they're able to do. What are the current and speculated applications in healthcare? And this is going to be my lightest section because it's all hype at this point. There's some application that has been posited, but not yet tested. But perhaps before that, it's just worth quickly talking about how these models are trained. So there are a few steps. There's pre-training, which is when you make it understand language much more generally. That's where the trillions of tokens that it is trained on comes in. There is then fine-tuning, which is when you actually teach it to answer questions and not just to complete sentences, because how it's trained is it's trained to complete sentences. There's reinforcement learning from human feedback or some other form of preference tuning to basically make sure that the values that are instilled in this model are aligned with the values of humans in general. And then with the medical use case, there's a subsequent step, which is domain or task-specific fine-tuning. So you tune it not just to answer questions in general, but you tune it to answer medical questions. You tune it to answer questions in a specific domain of medicine. Generally, I think we can think about applications of foundation models across 3 categories. So there are workflow and cost logistical applications. This is the most common. So you see they are very helpful in clinical documentation, summarization, medical notes, discharge summaries, that sort of thing. They're also meant to be quite useful for research. Well, I mean, it's fairly obvious that they would be useful for research where you're actually publishing papers. They're good for summarization, writing, rewriting for specific audiences. There's some excitement about their use for drug discovery, although I think details are sparse, so we'll see how that plays out. And then finally, diagnosis and treatment. I guess this is one of the most interesting applications. So far, these models have been treated as if they're just going to be deployed as question answering models. It's unclear where that application is going to be. Are they going to be deployed for public health? Are they going to be question answering models for general patients as an initial triage step before they go to the doctor? It's really not clear. And I think this is indicative of the level of infancy of like consideration of these models. It's still too early. We're still only seeing the sort of performance gains right now. So yeah, how does answering to standard medical tests or answering questions establish a clinical use case? It's not clear so far. But, okay, this is too small. But effectively what we're seeing here is the model summarizing clinical encounters, the model writing medical notes based on what has gone on within a clinical encounter, and the accuracy seems to be quite good. But the hype train is on. So medical AI chatbot is already being tested in hospitals. So in the Mayo Clinic, which Google has a fairly good partnership with, that's happening. And then as mentioned, it's improving documentation, improving workflow for clinicians, making it easier to search and summarize EHRs. And I think the latter is really where we're going to see a lot of benefit. So far, over the last 10 years, the most successful AI or machine learning models have been vision models. So you've seen a lot of progress when it comes to imaging tasks in radiology, et cetera. This is the time when we're actually going to see probably a similar gold rush when it comes to EHRs, where historically, machine learning hasn't quite made as much of a headway in. Light section, as I promised. But let's take a look at what the ethical and safety risks are. And I'm not planning on being comprehensive. I just want to raise a few risks. I think before we go and talk about the specific risks, it's important to think a little bit about one of the key risks that was in previous AI or machine learning models, which has only blown up even more with this, which is risks around explainability, risks around opacity, and the black box nature. Previous machine learning models were black box and opaque, and that was a problem because when you're dealing and reasoning across 1 million parameters, you can't represent those 1 million parameters to a human reasoner. The human reasoner will not be able to make sense of it. That's the fundamental tension between how models reason and how humans reason. The situation is not improved when we go from 1 million parameters to 1 trillion parameters. It's just become even more untenable. And so while previously, my belief is that while previously there was enthusiasm for restricting the complexity of machine learning models so you could have interpretable systems that could have the same level of performance, I think if these models end up showing performance gains across medical or clinical tasks as they are hyped to do, then interpretability or explainability may be less useful a way of assessing performance or assessing reliability or robustness, precisely because of how large these models are. And that underpins almost all the risks we talk about. I should have put all of this in a slide, but I forgot, but I thought it was important to talk about anyway, so here we are. But in terms of a sampling of the risks that I want to talk about, I think we can put it in 3 categories. So one is, what are the risks to health outcomes, right? Risks associated with the inability to guarantee or evaluate model performance. What are the fairness or justice risks? So risks associated with unequal outcomes potentially generated from model use. And what are the autonomy risks? So risks associated with any potential undermining of patient autonomy through the use of these models. Some of this is fairly known because we've all been playing around with ChatGPT at night. And so we have prompt brittleness, right? So small changes in prompts, whether you change it semantically, whether you change it grammatically, can produce divergent responses. And this is especially the case for zero-shot prompting. Zero-shot prompting is when you just ask a question, you don't give any examples, you don't give any explanation, you just ask the question. And this becomes a problem. Hallucinations are a huge problem, as we all know. I've tried to do lit reviews using ChatGPT. I have failed. So there is this tendency to manufacture facts, references, and other parts of their responses. And so both of these are problems. Both of these are being mitigated by various technical approaches. For instance, with hallucinations, you can ask the model to not rely on its latent knowledge that it has been trained on, but make reference to an exogenous database that, and then provide quotes when you give reasons or when you give recommendations. Whether or not that caps the gains in performance you will get with these models is an open question, but it is currently being trialed. I think the more interesting risk is around model evaluation, right? So previously, what happened with machine learning models was the very way in which they were trained allowed for their testing. You would have a data set, you would have a data set of images. Some images would have disease X present, some images would have disease X absent, and you could keep a portion of that data set for testing later on and train it on that initial portion. And through that, you would at least get some idea of what the performance would be. And you could assemble more images such as that with disease X absent or present, and you could test it even further, and you would get more validation of model performance. That's not exactly how these models are built, but more importantly, that's not how these models are used. So how models are trained, if you recall this slide, is they're trained on a wide variety of data, and they are then fine-tuned much more specifically around some bits of medical data, etc. But when we use these models, we are not using them to answer questions of just one sort. We are not using them to answer questions in one medical domain. The fact that they show translation across multiple domains means evaluation becomes a lot harder. You also have a lack of benchmark data sets. So it's because of the generality aspect of these models, it's very hard to assemble classification-based data sets for every task that they could be used for, because where does one task end and where does the other begin? And because of the fact that even if you could assemble classification data sets or benchmark data sets for some specific tasks, how do you make sure they're only used in that way? It's a hard problem. Current approaches are also not necessarily indicative of use case, as I mentioned. They're performing well above benchmarks or previous benchmarks for question answering, but is that the only way they're going to be used? It's not clear. We can only start to think a little bit about evaluation as the use cases reveal themselves. And so you still have evaluation of these models by human feedback, right? So over here for MedPalm 2, or MedPalm, I think, yeah, there was evaluation of the models by other physicians on things like how well do they represent the scientific consensus, what is the extent of possible harm that can arise out of their recommendation, what is the likelihood, you know, does the answer contain any evidence of correct reasoning steps and so on. And so you can have these sorts of physician evaluations, but it just goes back to the point of what about when a doctor wants to use it, if it gets to that point of performance for a particular workflow, how do you evaluate its fit in that workflow? And it goes back to the questions of, should we then start to think in terms of these models as being relevant for clinical trials, like Julian mentioned earlier. There is an interesting field of model written evaluation still that's growing. The idea being that, well, if you can't have these models evaluated by putting them against a data set, let's use large language models to evaluate large language models. And to be fair, this has shown certain promise, right? Because there has been a generation discrimination gap, so to speak, between their performance. So they do not always generate based on all that they know, but if asked to discriminate or evaluate an answer, they are much more likely to evaluate the answer based on more of what they know. And so it is a promising field, but it is very early stages at this point. Moving on to fairness and justice risks. So you have unequal representation of training data in the initial stages of pre-training of these foundation models. And this can affect data available for recall and reasoning for the different groups. So on the right, you have a table for Palm 2, which shows, apart from English, what are the languages that it has been trained on. And so you have Spanish at 11.5%, Chinese at 10.19%, Russian at 8.73%, and so on. I was thinking about it from, I come from India, so I was thinking about it from the subcontinent. The total number of representations of languages spoken in the subcontinent across Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka was less than 1.5% of the training data, when it was probably, I think almost 2 billion in total population. And so I think that's a problem. And it's not a sort of just a speculative problem. I did say I was playing around with ChatGPT at night. Actually, this is Bard. So I asked in English, what is your name? My name is Bard. I'm a large language model, also known as a conversational AI chatbot. I asked the same question in Hindi. I'm a large language model. I cannot answer that question. It's a very simple question, but very discriminative responses, or very different responses. But less anecdotally, more objectively, when these models are tested across different languages for the same tasks, you can see the performance dropping as indicated over there, even for Indonesian, Javanese, Bhutanese, and so on. There's a separate problem which is, I think, worth noting. It hasn't been shown to be the case yet, but I think it might. Like I mentioned, the estimated cost was about 100 million or over 100 million to train GPT-4. Inference costs are also not cheap, especially for medical applications. You can ask GPT or ChatGPT to give you a recipe with potatoes fairly simply without giving additional information. If you want to ask it to reason across medical application, reason more robustly, you would have to provide more context. You would have to provide more understanding to make sure that the answers are right. As it goes, this raises inference costs extremely because the context gets larger and larger, especially if you start thinking about having an external codified knowledge repository that this model leads on, right? It increases the size of these. It increases the cost of each inference quite rapidly. And so it's worth noting that this might skew this as a technology for more well-off communities, more well-off demographics, both in terms of direct users, but also in terms of application developers that build on top of these models. Autonomy risks. So far, because of the fact that chatbots seem to be one of the most common and effective means of delivering value from foundation models, and also that they are some of the most trialed digital health interventions more broadly, even outside of AI, it's likely that the increase in capability of chatbots through LLM will manifest in some sort of medical chatbots built on top of these models. And so it's important to understand the extent to which they're supporting or undermining shared decision-making and patient-centered medicine. And this is especially the case if they're deployed in ways that there is no human in the loop in the entire medical encounter, right? So if they're deployed just as a public health intervention or as an initial triage step on whether you need to go to the doctor and you don't need to go to the doctor, there may be many cases where there is no human in the loop. How do we actually test for whether shared decision-making is instantiated or not? There's some interesting work on this already, right? So there was a study comparing physician and artificial intelligence chatbot responses based on GPT, posted to a public social media forum. LLM-based chatbots were almost insultingly received as more empathetic than physician responses on these forums. Unfortunately, empathy is not the only underpinning value for shared decision-making. How well they represent the different risks, how well they represent reasonable risks, all of these are open questions and needs to be studied. So, where do we go from here? The hype keeps growing. Now, we can think about foundation models for generalist medical AI, not just task-specific. It can operate across all different modalities, across all different tasks, across all domains of medical knowledge. I think there are some issues that we need to solve, and I think we are far from discovering a robust use case, maybe sort of document-based clinical workflows, but there's still a lot more to think about, and that's where I'd like to stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Abhishek. A tour de force in hype management. Thank you. Plenty of time for questions. Who'd like to kick us off?
Thanks, that was fantastic. So I'm from New Zealand and I'm on the Ministry of Health Committee that's looking at clinical applications of AI. And so we just wrote a very quick position statement on LLMs in the clinical space as a kind of temporary position. So one thing that we were really worried about and that the privacy lawyers were worried about was the process of entering patient information into these, which from a privacy perspective is just contrary to our current legal guidelines. And you just didn't sort of mention that at all. I just wondered how that kind of fits in. And that seems to be kind of possibly a barrier to trialling these in the first place, other than people playing with them at night, as you say. Thanks.
It's absolutely a big risk. I didn't mention it just for the fact that there was limited time, and it's one of the areas which I'm less familiar with. But I know that there are specific worries with it. There are many techniques that have been developed that can reconstruct knowledge that was used by the LLM for training, and they're showing a lot of promise. And they're worrisome. The areas I'm sort of familiar with them in are more around like defense and national security, but they must be worrisome also from a medical training perspective. I don't have a stronger answer, except I think it's a very real problem. But in order to represent it better, I would have to read more about it. But absolutely. And
it might be that the privacy rules are too restrictive. Do you know what I mean? Maybe those need to change.
I mean, there are questions around like, to what because if we use these models just online as we do now, there are the interactions we have feed in to retrain the model, and that makes any information captured during that even more reconstructible. So maybe there are tweaks around delivering value without constant retraining, and maybe that would make their use in medical domains more palatable from a patient privacy perspective. Yeah.
Would you like to come in next, TC?
So I'm just trying to pick your brains on the idea of environmental risk as a serious risk within all the risks that you mentioned. So I think that ChatGPT really uses a lot of energy. I think it's equivalent to about more than 30,000 households use in any given day.
Yeah.
So I think it's increasingly there are more people noticing this, and they are arguing that bioethics ought to take very seriously the notion of environmental sustainability in relation to AI use. So a couple of ways this can actually creep in. So in research ethics, for example, when you're balancing benefits and risks, you should really take into account environmental risk and try to look for more sustainable solutions.
Yeah.
But I also can imagine that you should really don't use AI, ChatGPT for a lot of frivolous things that actually humans can do and can maybe even do better. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on how serious a risk is environmental risk, and what can be done to mitigate this risk?
Yeah. So I have two sets of thoughts on that. One, I mean, before those two, obviously environmental risks are huge. The compute externalities of training these models and inference, like using them in daily inference, are very high. One thought I have is more cynical, which is that I don't think that's really going to stop things. When GPT-4 was trained, what they did was, before training this massive model that they trained on, over 1 trillion parameters, they trained much smaller models to see how the performance gains were for these models. And so it's a very nice curve. I should have put it, but it was basically a curve like this, where this was sort of total sort of error rate, and this was size of the model. And they trained smaller models, right? And the error rate dropped extremely regularly. So it was a very fitted curve. And based on that, they made the decision to train a 1 trillion parameter model, and it fit right on that curve. What this suggests is that you can always make a very good financial case for training larger and larger models, right? And so cynically, that's just going to happen. And should we try and push back against it? Maybe. Depends on what kinds of benefits we get from it that we can then compare to the environmental costs, right? The less cynical answer is that I think this is being taken note of, and the kinds of model architectures that are being trialed now are more sort of hope-inducing. So for instance, Palm, which was that first Google model, was trained over 540 billion parameters. Palm 2 was trained over something like 300 billion parameters. It was just better architecture. And so that reduces the training, the inference costs. Fine-tuning, which was done in a way that required you to fine-tune all the parameters of the model, all billions or trillions of them, is now being done in parameter efficient ways. So you can identify which are the ones which need to change and just change those. So I think there are technically elegant solutions that are being developed that reduce that. How this space is going to evolve, whether the technically elegant solutions are going to ultimately hit a cap in terms of performance and we just have to go large again, it's anyone's guess. I think there are definitely motivations for going large, just in terms of the scaling laws, but yeah.
I have two questions related to size. Actually, first of all, I'm surprised to hear that the bigger the model, the more accurate it will be. But in my mind, if we build a model which is more specific for any particular purpose, with well, you can increase the number of parameters, but still confined to that specific purpose. Would that make it more accurate than generalize it to answer any type of questions in the medical terms, going into every specialty, that you can have so many combination and permutations that can create errors?
Yeah.
And the second question related to that is your last comment that foundation model to be applied in daily medical practice, you see that it's still a long way to go. But if we developed specific GPTs for different specific purposes, eye GPT and then nose GPT and so on, would that make it much faster to be practically useful in clinical practice?
Yeah. So those are great questions. I think it's important to understand where the performance gains come in when it comes to training these models. The reason why the model size has been becoming larger and larger and larger, and the data that it's been trained on has been becoming larger and larger and larger, is because when you make it larger, you hit a threshold of general reasoning that can then be pointed in any direction. If you create it small to begin with, you don't have that general reasoning ability that can then be pointed across eye or heart or anything else. So it's only once you train it to, so if to make things more concrete, if you train a 50 billion or like a 10 billion or like 500 million parameter model just for eye applications, it's not going to give you the performance of a 10 or 50 or 100 billion model that is trained for everything, because even the minimal level of performance you need only comes at those large sort of parameter sizes. So how you direct its use case more specifically happens in the fine-tuning later on. But that fine-tuning, whether it's done for medical or legal reasoning, whether it's done for sort of cardiovascular or some other form of medical reasoning, completely relies on that base level of performance that's established based on the pre-training stage. So if you train for a smaller amount of information, you may not get, or a smaller parameter model or smaller data with smaller amount of data, you may not get that base level of performance. You can't take it for granted. So even, which is why I say that, I think as far as costs and sizes go, where we need to look is probably better architecture, more efficient architecture. It's not a function of can we get away with training a smaller model. You probably can. There's some interesting work going on in this field where you can, there's work around distillation, which I'm not sure if people are aware of, which is that you train a smaller model based on the outputs of a larger model. And that allows the smaller model to get higher levels of performance that you couldn't get before. That's a general thing that's being explored now. It's not been explored for medical use cases or any domain-specific use cases. They're just exploring it for general conversational ability, right? There's also some other work going on around having larger models give explanations to smaller models, and that increases the performance as well. It's still an early sort of it's in its early stages, but I wouldn't discount the importance of going larger, even for the specific areas that you're concerned with.
It's very interesting that you just mentioned that and distillation as well. How is that different from the adversarial training, automated adversarial training? And just to cross-reference the previous presentation, could the MDR actually be, instead of a self-reporting by either the user facility or by the manufacturer, could it be using like the mechanisms that you just mentioned, as well as an adversarial, automated adversarial training? So that means to fine-tune it.
Yeah, so the adversarial training that happens, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not 100% sure, but to the best of my knowledge, it happens to sort of bring forward some of the risks that would have been captured in the stages post-deployment to pre-deployment, still within the company before release. So and that adversarial testing can happen where you enter a prompt that sort of makes sense in like a human sort of language way, and it yields results which are not that great or not safe. But it can also happen in ways where you construct a string of nonsensical characters, and that somehow pokes and prods the model into like giving unsafe outcomes. So the adversarial testing that was spoken about there was just around like mitigating from those sorts of harms. That being said, I think your point is a valid one. I think a lot of the sort of adversarial testing in more like sort of understandable ways can be done before release. And the reports, I think I would agree with Boris that it should be something that is passed on to the relevant authorities, except right now we don't really have the relevant authorities to intervene against that. Does that answer your question? I'm not quite sure I understood the gist of your question.
To detect error at an individual patient level, so I was thinking using population health data as a whole to use for the adversarial test. Does it make sense? So preempting before it.
What kind of population data would you use?
Like for example, the oximeter which I mentioned, if there is low oxygen level, therefore it will the patient will definitely develop COVID. But then the oximeter didn't read it properly, but then the patient went into the ER. So going backwards, that means there must have been some inaccuracies in a certain segment of the population before that. So adversarial, using that data, would you say?
So we can get into this more. I think the first thing is that I don't think it's necessarily the fact that there are inaccuracies in the population level data that led to the faulty reasoning from these sorts of models. Like you can have like accurate population level data, the model just reasons over it inaccurately, and that creates these sorts of adverse outcomes. But I think you're sort of making a deeper point than that. I'm just not able to sort of grasp it at this point.
I want to ask you a question about human-machine interaction or interface. There's no way that a human brain can compete with a machine that analyzes trillions of parameters, but we still think that human doctors have a role to play when we come to managing patients. And this concept of co-piloting between human and machines comes up. But I mean, it's just a term. How do you see co-piloting comes about in the future?
It's a very good question. I don't know. My entire PhD thesis is motivated by the fact that we need to set standards to how these things are used by the people who use them. A lot of the models that have been developed and released over the last 4 or 5 years or more have been released just as this is how the model works, this is what it does, please use it, and no further guidance given beyond that. And I think that makes it very hard to establish what the standard of care should be, how we judge negligence on the back of that, and how we judge, based on your question earlier, Mikey, whose fault is it really? Is it the fault of the user or is it a fault of the manufacturer? I don't have a satisfactory answer to your question. I don't know how these models should be used. I think the way we figure that out is by trialing them in sort of actual medical trials and seeing for which tasks we get the best response and which tasks we don't get the best response. And for each task, what ways of interacting with the model yields the best response. I think we need that sort of data before we can make a claim that this model performs better than a doctor, or doctors should use this model, or so on. I'm not convinced that we just have that initial level of fundamental data around different ways of using the model to see which one works better from a clinical outcomes perspective. But I think that work needs to be done.
Hi, yes. So my question is actually quite related to Prof's question earlier about the perception that language models might be seen to be more empathetic than human doctors. I thought that was quite surprising because in responsible AI literature, something that comes up a lot is that when it comes to primary care, at least, we want to have human doctors because there is this requirement of empathy and kind of this community aspect to healthcare. I wonder if I could just pick your brains a little bit on what you think the ethical implications of that are, because if we suppose that the AI is incapable of some genuine empathy, then at the very least these language models are being judged on the perception that they're exhibiting empathy, and suppose that human doctors do experience empathy for their patients. Do you think that there are any relevant ethical outcomes from that difference of kind of perceived empathy versus like real felt empathy from doctors? Thank you.
It's a good question. So when you say real empathy, you mean like subjectively feeling their empathy and doing it. I guess my question, and I don't have a clear answer. I have some ideas or like some like intuitions, but I don't have a clear answer. My question would be, how important is real versus perceived empathy for the maintenance or the undermining of autonomy, right? Because that's why we care about this, right? We care about this because we want patients to be able to exercise their autonomy. And what does exercising their autonomy mean? I'm not going to even try to answer that because there's so much work that's been done on that. But like at a narrow level, it means being given all the relevant information so that they can make the right decision. At a broader level, it means feeling heard, feeling like you have the environment is comfortable enough where you can raise certain questions, you can raise certain objections, and that's taken on. Is that impeded by perceived empathy versus like the actual presence of empathy? Maybe not. Maybe if it doesn't allow, if it allows them to still behave as they would with a completely actually empathetic doctor. I'm not 100% sure that like the presence of the subjective feeling of empathy like maintains autonomy more than an absolutely identical feeling of perceived empathy. Oh, it's a hornet's nest.
Yeah, Angela, one last question, I'll move to wrap up next.
I'm not sure it's a question. I was just going to say, just challenging your idea that the only valuable outcome is protecting autonomy. So certainly some philosophical conceptions of bioethics would say that. Other conceptions of care, for example, would say that there's value in caring relationships and that supports well-being in certain ways that isn't just about autonomy. But that's a whole different topic. So,
well, in that case, then my answer would be different. Then I would say that it makes a big difference then.
Right, okay, go.
Thank you. I won't keep you from your drinks for too much longer. I wanted to ask a question as well, Abhishek. So, sorry, I just drag you back to the stage. On this point about autonomy, because I think there's actually a lot going on in that kind of diagnosis you offered, person-centered care and shared decision-making. It seems to me, as you said, when these devices are used entirely as a kind of informational aid, it's really quite unproblematic and would liberate us potentially, as long as the information was of a good quality, from standard ways of getting information. If I'm going to ask for guidance about careers, it's better to look it up on Google, it seems to me, than talk to my dad, for example. So, human beings aren't necessarily the source of the best information. And that just seems quite obvious to me. But shared decision-making, I don't think it's about autonomy at all. I think it's about the ways in which we understand what we ought to do in a kind of deliberative exchange where different values are in play and are being negotiated. I think it's a mistake to think it's an autonomy-based practice. And that seems to me somewhere where these models don't seem to be able to do very much. And I'm very skeptical about people who advocate for using ChatGPT as a consent device for that precise reason. It seems like what you want as part of consent is this sort of interactive reassurances. The deliberation, the kind of interaction really matters. It's not merely about information. So I wonder whether you need to be differentiating the kind of information provision role from the deliberative exchange type role in those activities.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll ask you one in return. So we have different models of shared decision making, right? Like we've obviously gone past the paternalistic model. We've also gone past like what is called the informed model, where you just give the patient the relevant information and they make the decision from themselves, because we realize that patients want to be, like, we can't treat their values as a given. They often need to be constructed or reconstructed in a clinical encounter, and that needs to happen like under like what people have called the deliberative model or something else. My question then is, do you feel that under any circumstances would model-based reconstruction of values be as good as a human-based reconstruction of values? Or do you feel like just by definition of it being reconstructed by a model, even if the conversation is fluid, it's what you would have found in a doctor, the value reconstruction is just not the same?
I don't personally think it makes a substantive difference. No, I think you could potentially get to that point. And I think that's slightly separate from the empathy question, which I think raises different kinds of character-based concerns. But yeah, no, I think it's potentially possible, and that would meet the requirements of the kind of things we're thinking about. But I guess I have not seen that yet in any of the things I've ever seen from ChatGPT.
I don't think we're at that point.
No. Okay. Thanks so much, Abhishek, and thanks also, Boris, for wonderful talks.